I still remember the sound that night, a low, guttural roar that didn't come from any man or machine. It rolled across the valley like thunder, followed by a scream that froze the blood of everyone within earshot. By the time the sheriff arrived, the streetlights were flickering. The front gate was hanging open, and one of the most feared women in our community, Evelyn Sharp, the HOA president, was nowhere to be found. Most folks around here still whisper about what really happened on my land that night. Some say it was an accident. Others think I planned it. But the truth? Well, it's darker, messier, and far more satisfying than anyone could imagine. Because before that night, I was just a quiet homeowner, trying to protect what was mine. A few acres of farmland, a stubborn old bull named Titan, and a home built with my own 2 hands. But when the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association decided my land didn't fit the neighborhood aesthetic, they started a war they couldn't control. It began with letters, neat, polite, and venomous, accusing me of violations I didn't even know existed. Then came the fines, the threats, the meetings where Evelyn's thin smile hid something sharp and cruel. But the moment she stepped foot past my gate without permission, everything changed. That was the night lines were crossed. Not just legal ones, but moral ones. And once Titan saw her, it was already too late. What followed turned our quiet town upside down. Lawsuits, news vans, neighbors choosing sides, and the kind of secrets that tear entire communities apart. But the question everyone keeps asking, the one they still debate over coffee and wine, is this: did I really set her up, or did karma just do what karma does best? All I know is that when you push a man long enough, when you corner him in his own home, eventually, something breaks. And when it does, you better pray it's not the thing standing between you and the truth. Because in this neighborhood, justice doesn't come from the HOA boardroom. It comes from the field. And trust me, the bull remembers everything. When I first moved into Oak Ridge Estates, I thought I'd finally found peace. The kind of peace you feel when you step outside in the morning, coffee steaming in your hand, and all you hear is the wind brushing against the trees. The neighborhood was perfect, or at least that's what everyone said. Neat rows of manicured lawns, identical mailboxes, pastel-colored houses trimmed with white fences, and a sign at the entrance that read, Oak Ridge Estates, a community of harmony. It was the kind of place that looked like it belonged on a magazine cover. Perfect symmetry, polite smiles, and an air of quiet order. But beneath that polished calm, there was something else, something too still. Like a lake before a storm. My home sat at the edge of the subdivision, right where the pavement met open pasture. I was proud of it, a farmhouse-style property I'd built myself after years of saving. It wasn't fancy, not like the marble-clad homes in the cul-de-sac, but it was mine. I had space, a small barn, a vegetable garden, and Titan, my bull. He was massive, stubborn, and surprisingly gentle for his size, unless someone threatened what he cared about. Funny thing is, I'd grow to understand him more than any of my neighbors. When I first arrived, the community welcomed me with a mix of warmth and curiosity. Evelyn Sharp, the HOA president, was the first to greet me. She was a woman who walked like she owned the ground beneath her heels, every step measured, every word wrapped in sugar and poison. "We take pride in our community," she said, handing me a thick binder of HOA guidelines. "Rules keep everything beautiful, predictable. You'll see, Oak Ridge practically runs itself." At the time, I didn't think much of it. Rules are rules. But later, I realized that binder wasn't about beauty or order. It was about control. Evelyn's husband, Walter, rarely spoke, but when he did, his tone carried the finality of a judge's gavel. He managed the HOA's finances, or, as some whispered, Evelyn's private slush fund. Then there was Carol Benson, the vice president, who made it her life's mission to patrol the neighborhood with a clipboard and a camera, snapping pictures of anyone whose grass grew a little too long or whose garbage cans weren't perfectly aligned. She called it community vigilance. I called it obsession. And then there was Tom Reynolds, the youngest member of the board, a man who clearly didn't belong in their circle. He'd been dragged into the HOA after losing a bet at a Christmas party. or so the story went. Tom was the only one who treated me like a human being, not a violation waiting to happen. He warned me early on, voice low, eyes darting toward Evelyn's window. "Don't get on her bad side," he said. "She doesn't forget. And she doesn't lose." The first few months were fine. I kept to myself, fixed up the place, and tried to blend in. The neighbors were polite, overly polite. The kind of politeness that makes you wonder what they're saying behind closed doors. Mrs. Thompson from across the street baked me a pie and slipped in a note reminding me that farm animals aren't permitted in residential zones. I laughed it off, thinking it was a joke. Then came the first letter. It arrived neatly folded, with the HOA logo embossed at the top. Notice of violation, non-standard exterior appearance. Apparently, the shade of my barn was too rustic. It didn't align with the approved palette of neighborhood tones. I thought it was ridiculous, but I repainted anyway. A lighter, safer beige that made my once proud barn look like every other cookie-cutter structure in the neighborhood. A week later, another letter. Improperly stored equipment. This time it was my tractor parked near the fence line. They fined me $50. I paid it. I shouldn't have. Each notice got pettier, stranger, and colder. My garden was non-conforming. My mailbox was out of uniform. Even my fence, which had stood for decades before the HOA existed, was suddenly a safety concern. It was clear now this wasn't about rules. It was about reminding me that I didn't belong. But what truly unsettled me were the whispers. Neighbors began keeping their distance. Conversation stopped when I walked by, and every evening I'd see Carol's car slowly creeping past my house, headlights dimmed, her silhouette outlined by the glow of a phone camera. One night, I heard footsteps on my property, soft, deliberate. I stepped outside, flashlight in hand, and saw a shadow near the barn. It disappeared before I could shout. The next morning, I found a note taped to my door. "Comply or consequences." I brought it to Evelyn. She smiled that tight, rehearsed smile of hers and said, "I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding. But remember, community harmony requires cooperation." Something shifted after that. Meetings became colder. The HOA board started sending fines in bulk, demanding immediate payment for vague, cumulative infractions. My attempts to reason were met with rehearsed sympathy and bureaucratic doublespeak. "We're simply enforcing the rules equally," Evelyn would say. But I noticed her own front yard had a dozen decorative flags, her husband's truck sat overnight on the street, and Carol's hedges were 2 feet taller than the supposed limit. No one cared. The rules didn't apply to them. The worst part wasn't even the fines. It was the isolation. Neighbors I'd shared coffee with suddenly avoided eye contact. Kids who used to wave at me were hurried inside by their parents. The HOA's gossip machine was working overtime, painting me as the neighborhood troublemaker, the defiant farmer ruining property values. Still, I tried to stay calm. I told myself it would blow over. I even attended one of their monthly meetings to clear the air. The conference room smelled of disinfectant and cheap perfume, and the air buzzed with fake civility. Evelyn sat at the head of the table like a queen addressing her subjects. "We're here to maintain standards," she said sweetly, "not to target anyone." But then Carol pulled out a stack of photos. My house, my yard, my mailbox, my life, every image time-stamped and annotated. "He's non-compliant in 6 areas," she said proudly. The others nodded in approval. I realized then that this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a hunt. The final straw came during the 4th of July weekend. My friends from the next town over came by for a barbecue. We played music, not loud, just enough to drown out the crickets, and shared beers under the porch light. By 9 p.m., 3 HOA board members were standing at my gate, clipboards in hand. "You're violating noise ordinances," Evelyn said, her tone dripping with satisfaction. "And we'll be issuing a citation for hosting an unregistered gathering." Unregistered gathering. For a barbecue, I felt something inside me snap that night. Not anger exactly, but a deep simmering clarity. This wasn't going to stop. Not until I either broke or they did. Over the next few weeks, I started documenting everything. Every letter, every fine, every so-called inspection. Tom quietly slipped me copies of the HOA's meeting notes, and that's when I discovered something worse. Evelyn had been using her position to authorize maintenance projects that didn't exist, redirecting community funds into accounts she controlled. There were transactions, invoices, and even checks written in her husband's handwriting. It wasn't just me she was targeting, it was everyone. The difference was I was the only one who stood up. Still, I didn't know how far she'd go until that night, the night she crossed my fence without permission. She said she was conducting an inspection, but I knew better. She was looking for something to destroy, some justification to crush me completely. What she didn't expect was that Titan would be waiting. And as I stood on the porch that evening, watching her flashlight flicker across my property, I had no idea that moment, that trespass, would set everything in motion. The fines, the lawsuits, the investigation, and the night the entire town would never forget. I just remember thinking, as her shadow moved closer to the barn, so this is how it starts. What I didn't realize then was that it was also how it would end. By the time summer deepened, the air in Oak Ridge Estates didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt watched every time I stepped outside to water my plants, check the mail, or even stand on my porch. I could feel the invisible eyes of my neighbors tracking me from behind their curtains. The sound of sprinklers and birds had been replaced with whispers and the faint, distant click of phone cameras. The HOA's letters started coming faster, every few days now, each one sealed in the same glossy envelope with that smug, gold-embossed Oak Ridge logo. Violation, excessive vegetation growth. Violation, unauthorized structure. Final warning, non-compliance with HOA Bylaw 3.7b. The language was always the same, sterile, threatening, and deliberately vague. And every time I tried to dispute one, Evelyn Sharp, the HOA president, would reply with a form letter signed by the board, never by her, never by an actual person. At first, I tried to reason. I called the office, left polite messages, even attended another community meeting. But the moment I walked into that room, the temperature dropped. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Eyes turned. Evelyn smiled that tight, condescending smile that barely touched her lips. "Ah, Mr. Parker," she said. "We were just discussing property standards." The crowd chuckled. Quietly, but enough. They had pictures again. My mailbox apparently leaning at a non-standard angle. My fence, which they claimed posed a hazard to children. My garden hose, a visual obstruction. They'd fined me a total of $900 that month. When I protested, Evelyn didn't even blink. "You agreed to abide by HOA rules when you bought your property," she said sweetly. "If you can't maintain standards, perhaps Oak Ridge isn't the right community for you." That line, "perhaps Oak Ridge isn't the right community for you," stuck in my head for days. It wasn't advice. It was a warning. Then came the first escalation that crossed the line from nuisance to invasion. I woke one morning to find a bright orange notice stapled to my front door. Mandatory property inspection. The fine print said I had 48 hours to allow HOA representatives access to inspect and photograph all exterior structures. No warrant, no explanation, just an order. That night I saw Carol Benson, the HOA vice president and self-appointed compliance enforcer, circling my property in her golf cart, flashlight sweeping across my yard like a searchlight. I called out to her, asking what she was doing on my property at 11 p.m. "Just documenting, Mr. Parker," she said, eyes glinting. Don't want any misunderstandings. I recorded her that night, just in case. That's when she turned her flashlight directly at my face and said, "People who fight the HOA never last long." The next morning, my mailbox was gone. Just gone. Only the wooden post remained, broken and splintered. I reported it to the police, but the officer looked uneasy. "You have any proof who did it?" he asked. I showed him Carol's video. He sighed. "Sorry, sir. Unless you caught her in the act, there's not much we can do. It's private property. HOA disputes are tricky. That word again. I decided to dig deeper. With Tom Reynolds' quiet help, the only decent board member left, I started learning about the HOA's inner workings. Tom told me Evelyn had been president for 6 years, despite the bylaws limiting board terms to 3. He showed me minutes from a meeting where she'd temporarily extended her presidency due to community confidence. Every vote, every audit, every policy passed under her name, but what struck me most were the fines, thousands of dollars collected from residents, often for the same repeated violations. The money was supposed to go toward community maintenance, yet there were no records of projects, no repairs, no improvements. The only thing being maintained was Evelyn's power. As summer turned to fall, the harassment grew more personal. One morning, I stepped out to find that my fence had been spray-painted with the word non-compliant. Another day, someone dumped trash along my property line and filed a complaint accusing me of creating an eyesore. The board fined me $250 for negligence. When I tried to appeal, the hearing was postponed indefinitely. At that point, I realized the HOA wasn't just enforcing rules, they were orchestrating a campaign. They wanted to break me, but they didn't know who they were dealing with. I started keeping meticulous records, timestamps, photos, audio clips, and every single piece of correspondence. I built a file thick enough to fill a drawer. I even installed motion cameras around my house, disguised as bird feeders and garden lights. The first time one went off, I couldn't believe what I saw. Carol, again, sneaking across my lawn at midnight with a clipboard and a tape measure, jotting notes as she shined her flashlight on my porch. A week later, I received another fine. Unapproved decorative fixtures, 2 exterior cameras installed without HOA consent. That's when I realized they'd noticed I was fighting back. I tried to talk to my neighbors, hoping for support, but they'd already been poisoned. Mrs. Thompson, the same woman who once brought me pie, now avoided eye contact. Her husband muttered something about keeping the peace. A younger couple told me, "You don't mess with Evelyn. She'll find something." Everyone was scared. Then, just as I started to feel cornered, something new surfaced, something Evelyn hadn't planned for. Tom found a file, a confidential HOA legal memorandum that had accidentally been attached to a public email thread. It outlined a special assessment plan that would increase homeowner dues by 40% for beautification projects. But the kicker was the fine print. The board had already allocated the funds for administrative costs, including presidential compensation. Evelyn was paying herself. When Tom confronted her in a meeting, she turned ice cold. "You're out of line," she hissed, eyes flicking to the others. "Remember who you work with." By the next week, Tom's mailbox was vandalized. Then his yard was cited for overgrown shrubbery. 2 days later, he resigned. That night, he came to my house, pale and shaking. "They won't stop, Parker," he said. "You need to get out. Sell the house. It's not worth it." But that was the thing. I couldn't sell. Evelyn had already labeled my property under review for compliance violations. No realtor would touch it. No bank would underwrite it. I was trapped. So I did the only thing I could. I started exposing them. I sent anonymous letters to local news outlets, posted screenshots of the fines, and hinted at financial misconduct. I didn't name Evelyn directly, but I made sure anyone reading would start asking questions. And for a brief moment, it worked. Whispers started spreading, people asking why their dues kept rising while their streets fell apart. Then Evelyn retaliated. Hard. A certified letter arrived one morning with the HOA seal stamped in red. Notice of legal action. They were suing me for defamation and creating a hostile environment. They demanded $25,000 in damages and immediate removal of all public posts. I laughed at first, a hollow, bitter sound. But deep down, I felt something twist in my gut. They were escalating into a legal war. That week became a blur of court filings, phone calls, and sleepless nights. My savings drained fast. Lawyer fees, fines, paperwork. My house, the dream I'd built with my own hands, was slipping away, one violation at a time. But I wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. I spent nights combing through the HOA bylaws, searching for loopholes, inconsistencies, anything I could use. And then I found it, a clause buried on page 187. Any member of the HOA board found guilty of financial misconduct may be immediately suspended pending investigation by an independent auditor. All I needed was Proof one evening I caught a break. Carol showed up at my fence gloating. "You really think you can win, Parker? Evelyn runs this place. Always has, always will," she smirked, holding up her phone. "Besides, the fines are automatic. You'll never even see them coming." Automatic. That word echoed in my head. Later that night, I hacked into my online HOA account. Nothing fancy, just an inspection of the payment logs. That's when I noticed it. Every transaction timestamp was identical, down to the second. The fines weren't being manually approved. They were pre-programmed. Evelyn had set up an automated billing system that charged homeowners without board approval. That was my evidence. I printed everything. Screenshots, payment logs, bank records Tom had sent me before resigning, and compiled them into a single, damning folder. I sent copies to the county clerk, the local paper, and the state housing authority. I knew the storm was coming. The next morning, I woke to find my front gate torn off its hinges and a red spray-painted message across my barn. Traitor. My cameras caught 3 figures, masked but unmistakable. Carol's walk was too distinct. The way she carried her flashlight, her posture, everything. When I brought the footage to the police, they hesitated again. "Looks like a prank," one said. Maybe kids, but a few days later, the local paper broke the story. Oak Ridge HOA accused of fraud and harassment. State launches investigation. The fallout was instant. Evelyn called an emergency meeting, which I wasn't invited to, but I stood outside anyway. Voices rose, people argued. Some shouted my name. And for the first time since moving there, I saw cracks in her perfect empire. But Evelyn wasn't done. The next week, a letter arrived, not from the HOA this time, but from the county. Complaint of code violations and animal endangerment. They were accusing me of mistreating Titan, my bull. Someone had filed multiple reports claiming I kept him in unsafe conditions. That one hit deep. Titan was family. When animal control arrived, I walked them through the property, showing them everything, the clean stalls, fresh water, open pasture. The officer nodded, clearly uncomfortable. "Honestly, sir," he said quietly, "this is one of the best-kept setups I've seen. But we got 3 separate complaints this week. We're required to follow up." As they left, I spotted Evelyn standing across the street, arms folded, watching. Her lips curved into a smirk before she turned and walked away. That was it. The moment I realized this wasn't about property or money anymore. It was about control, absolute, unrelenting control. The harassment reached a fever pitch. Letters came daily, sometimes twice a day. Fines stacked into thousands. Power accidentally shut off. Trash pickup suddenly skipped my address. Even the mailman seemed nervous delivering my post. But through the chaos, I kept one thing in mind. The investigation was still active. I just had to survive long enough for it to finish. One night, I was sitting by the window when Titan began to stir, low and restless. I saw the beam of a flashlight near the barn again. I grabbed my phone and stepped outside quietly, camera recording. There she was. Evelyn herself, standing at my fence, bolt cutters in hand, trying to open the latch. I shouted her name, and she froze. For a second, our eyes locked, hers wide with fury, mine steady with disbelief. "You're trespassing," I said. "Get off my property." Her voice trembled, but her words were venom. "You've ruined everything." She dropped the cutters and stormed away, but I got it all on camera. That was the moment everything changed. The moment she crossed the line from manipulative tyrant to criminal. And as I stood there in the quiet night, recording still running, I realized something. The game wasn't over. It was only beginning, because for every letter, every fine, every sleepless night they'd caused me, the truth was finally coming to light, and Oak Ridge Estates was about to burn. By the time it all came crashing down, the line between control and chaos had blurred beyond recognition. Oakwood Crest was no longer the quiet, manicured paradise it pretended to be. It had become a war zone of words, rules, pride, and power. And at the center of it all stood Evelyn Carter, trembling but unbroken, facing down an entire HOA board that had finally gone too far. It started with a letter, slipped under her door before dawn. The envelope was plain, unmarked, but the handwriting, sharp, angled, deliberate, was unmistakable. It was from Linda Grayson, the HOA president. The message was short. You have until Friday to remove all non-compliant structures from your property or face legal action. The non-compliant structure she referred to was Evelyn's wheelchair ramp, built for her father, who'd suffered a stroke months prior. A ramp that had been approved by the city, built to code, and painted to match the house. But to the HOA it was an eyesore, a violation of aesthetic continuity. They didn't care that it was a matter of accessibility. They only cared that it didn't fit their version of perfection. When Evelyn called the emergency HOA meeting to plead her case, she walked into a trap. The boardroom lights buzzed faintly overhead, the walls lined with framed photos of smiling neighbors, people who had no idea what kind of quiet tyranny governed their lives. Linda sat at the head of the table, flanked by her loyal lieutenants, Carl, the treasurer who treated fines like trophies, and June, the secretary who recorded every word but twisted the meaning of each sentence. Evelyn spoke. Evelyn brought her father's medical records, the city permit, even a signed note from the building inspector. But Linda's lips curved into a cold smile. "This isn't about legality," she said. "This is about the look and feel of our community." The room went silent. Evelyn's voice wavered, but her anger was steady. "The look of the community? My father can't even walk to the mailbox. Is that what matters to you?" Linda leaned back, tapping a pen against her folder. "Rules are rules. If we let you bend one, others will follow. You can't expect exceptions." That night, Evelyn returned home to find a yellow notice pinned to her ramp. "Final warning." Beneath it, in small print, "Failure to comply will result in immediate removal by HOA enforcement." 2 days later, she woke to the sound of metal being cut. Outside, 2 hired workers were dismantling the ramp under Carl's supervision. Her father watched from the living room window, tears streaming down his face. Evelyn ran out, screaming for them to stop. She filmed everything, the cutters, the laughter, the way Carl stepped back with smug satisfaction as she begged them to leave. That video hit the internet within hours, and it exploded. Thousands of comments flooded in. Outrage, sympathy, and disbelief poured across every platform. Local news stations called. Neighbors started whispering, quietly at first, then openly. And yet the HOA didn't back down. They doubled down. The next week they fined her for unapproved exterior recording devices, her doorbell camera, then for unmaintained lawn edges, her grass trimmed but not to their precise measurements. Then came the community harmony violation for disruptive online behavior. The HOA had written a new bylaw overnight just to target her. Evelyn started receiving letters from her mortgage company. The HOA had filed liens. She could lose her home. That's when something in her broke, but not in the way they expected. She stopped reacting, stopped pleading. She smiled when Linda passed her at the mailbox. She even waved to Carl. To the board it looked like surrender. But behind the scenes, Evelyn had begun to fight back with precision, patience, and proof. She'd spent months quietly documenting every infraction the HOA had made themselves. Illegal surveillance, improper financial reporting, a conflict of interest involving the landscaper who happened to be Linda's brother-in-law. She filed Freedom of Information requests. She worked with a lawyer who specialized in HOA corruption cases. And when the time came, she didn't go to court. She went to the press. A local investigative reporter picked up her story. Within days, the footage of the ramp demolition, the fines, and the secret HOA recordings aired on evening television. The segment was titled Power, Privilege, and the HOA When Rules Go Too Far. That same night, Evelyn received another letter. This time, it wasn't from the HOA. It was from the State Attorney General's office. They were launching an inquiry into Oakwood Crest's HOA for harassment, discrimination, and financial misconduct. The next morning, the boardroom looked different. Gone was the smug confidence. Linda sat at the head of the table, her hands shaking. Reporters waited outside. Neighbors filled the hallway, their voices sharp with anger and betrayal. For years, people had been too afraid to speak, but now Evelyn's courage had given them permission. The HOA meeting turned into chaos. One neighbor stood up, slamming down a stack of fines she'd been issued for inconsistent flower colors. Another shouted about a mysterious maintenance fee that never went to maintenance. Every accusation tore another piece from the board's facade. Linda tried to restore order, shouting over the noise. "This is all a misunderstanding. We followed procedure." Evelyn stood slowly, her calm voice slicing through the noise. "You followed your rules, not the law. You humiliated my father. You tried to destroy my life. And now, it's your turn to answer for it," the crowd erupted. The cameras flashed, and in that moment, years of control, manipulation, and fear began to unravel. Days later, Evelyn's case hit national news. Lawyers lined up to represent other residents. A class action suit was filed. Linda and Carl were subpoenaed. June resigned before she could be questioned. The HOA's funds were frozen pending audit, but the real climax came 1 month later during the final court hearing. The HOA's lawyer tried to argue that Evelyn had defamed the board by posting the ramp video. The judge interrupted, raising a hand. "You demolished an accessibility ramp without legal authority, and then fined her for recording it. That's not defamation. That's evidence." The silence that followed was suffocating. Evelyn sat there, hands clenched, tears forming as the judge continued. This board's behavior was not only unethical, but discriminatory. The court orders immediate restitution, public apology, and dissolution of the current HOA leadership. Linda's face drained of color. Carl stared at the floor. Evelyn turned to see her father smiling, faintly, whispering, "You did it." When they left the courtroom, the reporters swarmed. But Evelyn didn't gloat. She didn't need to. Justice, long denied, had finally found its way through. That night, as rain fell softly on Oakwood Crest, the neighborhood looked different. The light seemed warmer, the air quieter. Neighbors who once avoided her now stopped to talk, to apologize, to thank her. The HOA signs at the subdivision entrance were removed. The rules rewritten. In her driveway, Evelyn paused, looking at the rebuilt ramp. Stronger, wider, permanent. The sound of her father's wheelchair rolling down it filled her chest with something she hadn't felt in months. Peace. And yet, beneath the calm, there was a lingering truth she couldn't shake. An understanding that power, even in small communities, could twist into cruelty if left unchecked. She looked up at the houses around her, their tidy lawns and trimmed hedges, and whispered to herself, "Never again." The HOA thought they could silence her with rules. But in the end, it was their own arrogance that destroyed them. And as the camera faded to black, Evelyn's voice carried through one final time, soft but resolute. Maybe the real question isn't how far an HOA will go to control you, but how far you're willing to go to take your freedom back. The storm didn't end with the gavel strike. It only shifted. The day after the court's decision, the once pristine neighborhood of Oakwood Crest was nearly unrecognizable. The same residents who used to keep their curtains drawn, pretending not to see Evelyn's battles, were now out on their lawns, whispering, pointing, and for the first time in years, questioning. The illusion had cracked. The masks were falling. For so long, Oakwood Crest had lived under an unspoken law. Keep quiet, comply, and you'll be left alone. But once Evelyn exposed what really went on behind those glossy newsletters and perfectly trimmed hedges, people began to remember something they'd lost, their voices. It started small. A neighbor named Mrs. Hampton, who used to nod politely at Evelyn, but never speak more than a few words, came to her door with a plate of lemon bars and an apology trembling on her lips. "I saw what they did to you," she said softly. "I just didn't know what to do before." "None of us did," Evelyn smiled, a tired, genuine smile. "You do now," she replied. By the weekend, a community meeting was organized, not by the HOA, but by the residents themselves. They gathered in the park where the HOA used to hold their mandatory picnics, though this time there were no clipboards, no rules about approved seating or snack packaging. People spoke freely, louder, bolder, angrier. Stories spilled out like flood water. One man recounted how he'd been fined for hanging a flag on his porch because it wasn't proportionate. Another woman had been threatened with legal action for painting her shutters a color that wasn't in the HOA palette, even though she'd been given the wrong swatch. The more they shared, the more the crowd realized Evelyn's story wasn't unique. It was just the one that broke through. And as the microphone was passed from hand to trembling hand, it became clear that Oakwood Crest wasn't just fighting a group of board members anymore. They were fighting the system that had allowed them to exist unchecked. The petition to dissolve the HOA entirely spread like wildfire. Within 3 days, over 80% of homeowners had signed. Within 2 weeks, the county inspector's office launched a full audit. What they found shocked everyone: misused funds, fraudulent invoices, and even kickbacks from contractors who'd been hired repeatedly for community maintenance that never happened. Linda Grayson, once the untouchable president of the HOA, now faced multiple charges: fraud, harassment, and civil rights violations. Her empire of control had collapsed overnight. Carl tried to flee responsibility, claiming he just handled the books. But the paper trail told a different story. June, the secretary, handed over her files in exchange for immunity, and in doing so, confirmed everything Evelyn had claimed. When the local news returned to cover the fallout, Oakwood Crest was a picture of poetic justice. The for sale sign that once stood defiantly in Evelyn's front yard, placed there by the HOA to shame her, was now planted in front of Linda's home. The difference was, this time it was real. The bank had foreclosed. For the first time in years, the air in Oakwood Crest felt lighter. Neighbors started repainting their homes in colors they actually liked. Some tore down the identical mailbox posts and replaced them with unique designs. Small acts of rebellion that meant everything. Children played in the street without being told their laughter was too loud. And for Evelyn, mornings were peaceful again. Her father, whose health had declined during the ordeal, now spent his afternoons on the porch, reading and smiling at passers-by who waved instead of looking away. The new ramp gleamed in the sunlight, a symbol of everything they had fought for. Evelyn herself had changed. The fear that once followed her every move had burned away, replaced by a quiet, unshakable strength. She'd started writing again, something she'd stopped doing long before the HOA war began. Late at night, she'd sit by the window, listening to the rustle of trees and the hum of crickets, documenting not just what had happened, but why it mattered. The story spread far beyond Oakwood Crest. Other communities reached out, people living under the thumb of similar associations, victims of petty power and unchecked rules. They called her, wrote to her, thanked her for giving them the courage to fight back. Some even called her a hero. But Evelyn never saw herself that way. She always said, "I just told the truth louder than they could hide it." Months passed, and the neighborhood rebuilt itself, not just physically, but emotionally. Without the HOA's grip, residents began creating a true community. They formed a neighborhood council, open, transparent, voluntary. The first rule written on their charter was simple: no one shall be punished for living their life. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. What had once been a place obsessed with perfection now thrived in its imperfections. Lawns weren't uniform anymore. Some were wild with flowers, others neatly trimmed, and no one cared either way. The fences didn't match. The mailboxes didn't align, but the people smiled, freely, genuinely, for the first time. Meanwhile, Linda's downfall became a cautionary tale. Her trial was public, and every sordid detail made the papers. When the verdict came down, guilty on all counts, Evelyn didn't attend. She didn't need to. Justice wasn't about watching someone fall. It was about standing when they'd tried to make sure you never could again. One day, a few months later, Evelyn found a letter in her mailbox. No return address. Inside was a handwritten note that read, "You didn't just save your father's home. You saved all of us." It was signed simply, "A Neighbor." She tucked it into her journal, right between the pages where she'd written about the night they tore down the ramp and the day they rebuilt it. But the impact didn't stop there. Local lawmakers took notice of her case. A new bill was proposed, the Homeowner Fair Practices Act, aimed at preventing HOAs from overstepping legal and ethical boundaries. Evelyn was invited to speak at the hearing. Standing before the committee, her voice calm but resolute, she said, "I'm not here to destroy HOAs. I'm here to remind everyone that rules were meant to protect communities, not control them. Somewhere along the way, power replaced purpose, and it cost people their peace, their dignity, sometimes even their homes. No one should have to fight a war just to live freely." When she finished, the room stood in applause. The bill passed 3 months later. Oakwood Crest slowly became known not as the perfect neighborhood it once claimed to be, but as the one that changed everything. Documentaries were made, articles were written, and every story ended the same way, with a picture of Evelyn's rebuilt ramp, shining beneath the morning light. Years later, when her father passed away, the neighborhood rallied together in ways that would have been unthinkable before. They brought meals, planted flowers along the ramp, and told stories about the man who'd smiled at everyone who once turned away. That night, as Evelyn sat on the porch, she looked out at the homes that had once been battlegrounds. There was laughter now, music drifting from open windows. Life had returned, real, imperfect, human life, and yet she couldn't help but think of the cost, the sleepless nights, the fear, the humiliation, all for a simple act of care, for her father's dignity. She whispered to herself, all that pain, just to be left alone in peace. But peace wasn't all she'd earned. She'd sparked something bigger, a reckoning, a reminder that even in the quietest places, power unchecked can rot everything it touches. The camera would linger here, on Evelyn's face, illuminated by the porch light, the rebuilt ramp glowing beside her, the sound of laughter echoing in the distance, and as the scene faded to black, her final words would stay with the audience. Steady, honest, unforgettable. They thought they could break me by taking what I built, but all they did was teach me how to build stronger. And if they ever try again, well, this time they won't find silence waiting for them. A pause, the soft hum of wind. Then, one last line, a whisper sharp enough to cut through the quiet. Tell me, how many rules does it take before a neighborhood forgets what it means to be human?